Welcome to this webinar on running an effective meeting. This webinar is part of a series of webinars that are being carried out by Impact Hub Inverness and partners on behalf of Allens & Allens Enterprise under the Board Health Check Skills and Training contract. As I said, this session is looking at how to run an effective meeting, and you will get some hints and tips on good ways of keeping a meeting on target and focused. And my name is Polly Chapman and I work for Impact Hub Inverness. We're going to look at different types of meetings, who should attend your meeting, how you draw up an agenda for the meeting and circulate papers, actually conducting the meeting, minuting the meeting, and then dealing with some difficult situations. So first of all, really the first question you should be asking yourself is, do you actually need to have a meeting? Is the topic that needs discussed, assuming that there is one, is that something that could actually be covered by some other means? Would an email being circulated be an appropriate way of tackling it? So always ask yourself that question first, because there's nothing worse than going to a meeting and coming away and thinking, well, what was the point of that meeting? But we're going to talk about different kinds of meetings that you might get involved in. Most of the focus will be on board meetings, but also an AGM, the use of subgroups, meetings involving stakeholders and the public, and so on. And although the main focus of the webinar will be on board meetings, a lot of the tips will be useful for other kinds of meetings that you might get involved in. So first of all, you've decided that a meeting is an appropriate thing to do. And so the next thing to think about is who should actually be at your meeting. And really key to this is actually looking at your governing documents and seeing who should be there. So if it's a board meeting, that's usually fairly straightforward. It's the members of the board. And when I say it's fairly straightforward, there've been instances of groups I've been involved in where they haven't actually been clear who their directors or their trustees were. So actually making sure you know who your directors are or your trustees. If it's an AGM and you're inviting members, make sure you know who your members are. Do you have a proper list of them? And what does your governing document say about who has a right to be at the meeting, how they should be invited to the meeting, and so on? If it's your board, one of the things that you need to think about is how representative of the population as a whole the board of directors is. So do you have young people, older people, people from different sections of the community? And is there anything that you can do to fill any gaps that you've got? And the use of technology is one of the really important things that you can look at if you're trying in particular to get young people involved, or if you're trying to get people who might not be able to access a physical space, either because of work at the time or caring responsibilities or physical mobility issues. So there are ways of using the technology to enable you to get different voices in your community heard on the board. So have a think about those. And also think about whether there's anything about the location of your meeting that might make it less acceptable or accessible to some people. So obvious things are, is it Disability Discrimination Act, DDA compliant? It may not be, but if it is, it still may not be appropriate for all the sections of the community to come to the space. So holding a meeting in someone's house could be exclusive. It could make some people feel uncomfortable with attending a meeting. So try and find a neutral space in which to hold your meeting that's not going to put some people in the community off coming along to the meeting. Using technology, we've all got very used to using Zoom or similar technology in the last couple of years. We're probably all pretty sick of it. I know I am, but looking at how you can use it to make your meetings more accessible in the longer term is one thing that you can do, and not throwing it out just because the pandemic is over, but looking at hybrid methods. Using technology is a really good way of getting young people who might have left your rural community engaged in your board at a local level. They might have intentions to come back. They might be away temporarily at university or college or something. And using technology enables them to join the meeting and keep a foot in the community and be involved. The other thing to think about is the skills that you need on your board. So making sure you've got a good range of skills that are appropriate to the task that your organization is involved in delivering. So some common skills that you'd want to have on your board would be business, finance, legal, HR, those sorts of generic skills. And also you might want some specific skills to do with the kinds of work that you do. So if you're a charity that is providing support for people with head injuries, you might want to look at getting a health input, someone who not necessarily has experience of a head injury themselves directly, but maybe through their family or through their profession have experience of and understand the needs of that client group. The composition of subgroups is important. The use of subgroups opens up the possibility of including people with a wider skill set than you might get on your board, because they don't have to be a board member. Not everybody in your subgroup needs to be a board member. So you can bring in specialists who are willing to give their time and their expertise, but don't want the commitment of being on a full-time or being a full-time trustee of a board. So make sure that your subgroups are made up of people who actually have the skills and the experience to help drive the work of the subgroup forward. And they're not just the people who put their hands up first and volunteer to go on the subgroup, because that's not necessarily going to give the best outcome for your organization. So your meeting is happening, you've got a date set, the date has been circulated and everybody's aware of it. You then need to put your agenda out and the papers that go with it. And it's really important that the agenda and the papers go out ideally with a week's notice. So that gives people time to sit and read the papers. It gives them time to think about them and to think about any questions that they might have or what their views might be on any items on the agenda that you want a decision on. Sometimes it can be advisable to put any AOCB as the first item on the agenda, just in case there are things that have come up since the last meeting, since the papers were put together. Is there anything that's come up that needs urgently addressed by the meeting? And by putting it as a first agenda item, you don't necessarily have to discuss the things, but it means that everyone is aware of what the AOCB is. And if it's something important, it can be looked at that point, or it could be looked at further down the agenda, or it can be left till the end. But at least that has been a conscious decision that all those things are out in the open. The next item on the agenda should be a standing item, which is conflicts of interest. Every organisation should have a register of interests so that you all know what other people's interests are, and that should be updated. But you should still have a standing item on your agenda of conflicts of interest in relation to any items that are coming up on the agenda. And that just gives people an opportunity to say, yeah, item number 3, I have an interest there. This is what my interest is. A decision can then be made as to whether it's appropriate for you to actually sit in on that item, or whether you need to leave the room for that item, and how as a group you're going to handle that conflict of interest. And ideally you would have a conflict of interest policy that sets out what your approach will be as an organisation. And it's really important that if someone does declare a conflict of interest, that is noted in the minutes, and also what response the board has taken to that. So if the person has been requested to leave the room for the duration of that item, then that needs to be recorded in the minutes that Susan left the meeting, and then Susan rejoined the meeting after item 3 was dealt with. If there is an issue in your organisation of things running over and items, the first big item taking up all the time and not getting on to the other items on the agenda, it might be useful to put some timings on against each item actually on the agenda, which makes people see how long the meeting can be expected to last. And it will also help focus the mind so that things don't drag on the first substantive item and then not actually progress onto the other items. And that can really help focus and move the meeting forward. For each item on the agenda, it should be clear why the item is there. So are you putting up a report for information, or is it for a decision? If it's for a decision, what decision is it to appoint A or B, or is it a decision about whether to spend X amount of pounds doing a particular piece of work? Whatever, make it really clear what is being asked of the board for that item. And it may just be for information, and if it's for information, then there shouldn't really be a huge amount of discussion. People might have a few questions, but it enables you to then move on quite quickly to the next item. And once you've dealt with an item, it's useful if the chair can summarize the discussion of that around that item, and also record verbally and clearly what decision has been taken in regard to that item, and who is responsible for acting on that decision if that's appropriate, and any time scale. And that really just makes sure that, particularly if you've had a really long discussion about something, it makes it really clear who is tasked with doing what the decision has been, and it makes it very easy for the minute taker to then record that. And it also makes it clear to everybody what decision was actually made and reached collectively as a group. And it helps you to then wrap up that item and move on to the next one. The other thing you may want to consider is whether you need any ground rules for how meetings are run. So for instance, you might have a ground rule about how long anyone can speak on any particular item, particularly if someone dominating the conversation is a common problem that you have as a board. So you might want to collectively set the ground rules for your meetings and agree those as a group. When you're chairing a video meeting, there's a few things that you've probably discovered, but it's amazing how many of these things still happen. Use of the mute button. What is your rule? What is your rule on raising your hand? Do you raise a hand physically? Do you want people to raise a hand using the buttons? Or do you want people to just unmute themselves and pitch in? How do you want to manage that conversation so that it is a conversation and everyone gets the opportunity to speak? It's really important that people can be seen on video meetings. And that's not just about people putting their cameras on, but it's about actually, if there's more than one person in the room, that you can move the screen around so that whoever is speaking can actually be seen when they're speaking, because that makes it so much more easy to see, to understand the tone and so on of what people are saying. And particularly if you're chairing the meeting, you need to actively, it's much more necessary to actively try and engage people in the meeting. There is a very slight time lag, so you need to be mindful of that. It can be really hard to stop somebody in mid-flow to get your point across. So as a chair, you need to make it really easy and actively possibly go around everybody and check whether they've got anything they want to say, rather than just leave it to them to jump in. And these things become really, really important if you're in a hybrid meeting where some people are in the room together and some people are on screens. And there's a tendency then for anybody that's in the room to dominate the discussion. And for the people who are dialing in and are there remotely to not actually manage to find an opening in the conversation to make their point heard. So you have to actively invite them to speak. And it's also important in a hybrid meeting to only allow one conversation to happen at a time. So in the room where there are people gathered, you can only have one conversation going on. If you have two conversations happening at the same time, the person who is dialing into the meeting will be totally and utterly lost. So you need to be very, very mindful of their position. Your minutes. Ideally, you have someone taking the minutes so that you're not having to chair and be actively engaged in the meeting as well as taking the minutes. But it's really important that the minutes are short and succinct. They are not meant to be a record of the whole meeting. They're not meant to be a word-for-word account of what was discussed. They are meant to be a record of decisions that have been made. You might want to have a short explanation as to why that decision was reached. You also want a note of any action points and who has been assigned to deliver on that action, and any timescales that they need to meet and delivering that. And once completed, first of all, they should be written up really quickly, because certainly I look at my notes after a while and I don't understand what any of them mean anymore. So doing it really quickly while it's fresh in your mind is important, but then it should be circulated as a draft within a week of the meeting happening. And one of the reasons for doing that is, like I say, it makes more sense. It enables you to make more sense of the notes that you've taken of the meeting. But it also means that any action points are flagged up to the person who's been assigned with those actions. It's a reminder that they actually have something they ought to be doing. And it's much more likely that those actions will be acted on if they've been sent that reminder. And it's also a courtesy to anybody who wasn't at the meeting to see what was discussed and what decisions were made. And so that they can be, they then have a chance to engage a bit more on the things that they've missed. So one thing I actually didn't mention, just looking at common challenges, what to do if there are directors who regularly miss meetings. A lot of people's organisations' governing documents will say that if you miss 3 meetings in a row, for instance, without good cause, then that is a ground for removing people off the board. And I know that in a small community, that may be the last thing you want to do, because you'll struggle to recruit new directors. But it's better to have a smaller group of active, engaged directors and to have a bigger group of directors who actually don't turn up to the meetings. So look at your governing documents, and is there something in there that enables you to raise the issue with the director that's not coming, and look at getting them removed. So that's one thing that you can do. If one director is dominating the discussion, you can introduce those timings into your agenda, as I mentioned before. You could also have something in the ground rules that people can only speak for so long on any one item. Or you can have a ground rule that says for each item you will go around the table and everybody will be given a certain amount of time to talk about the item and discuss it. So having a ground rule that is common across everybody doesn't mean that you're targeting one director, but it enables you to deal with that situation. Conflicts of interest, I mentioned that already. It's not unusual in smaller communities where people have multiple roles and positions on other groups. Quite often it might be your cousin who's there, or a piece of land that you're involved in that is under discussion. It's about declaring those interests. It's about being upfront about it. It's also about other people on the board having the confidence to say, actually, John, I know that you've got a conflict of interest there. Have you forgotten that? Whatever it is, if John hasn't declared a conflict of interest. So don't be afraid to raise conflicts of interest if you are aware of other people's potential conflicts, and getting it out in the open, recording that, dealing with it, and then moving on. And that way it gives transparency to the whole community as to what's been happening. How to deal with hostility, that can sometimes happen. It's a case really of, it depends on the situation, but one way of tackling that is to say to the person who is being hostile that it's not appropriate at that moment in time to deal with it, but you would ask them to put it in writing and it will be dealt with at the next meeting. And quite often that distance in time and actually the act of putting something in writing can start to diffuse the hostility and make it much easier to tackle in the longer run. One of the other challenges that's not on there is people who consistently turn up late for meetings. That then has a knock-on effect and can mean that you delay starting the meeting, and so the meeting ends up going on much later, and that can put people off. And so the simple solution there is start the meeting when you say you're going to start the meeting. And if people aren't there, then that's fine. They will soon learn that the meeting starts at 7 o'clock when it says it's going to start at 7 o'clock, and they will come for 5 to 7. And if by delaying the meeting and starting it when the last person arrives, you're actually punishing those people who have turned up on time and rewarding those who haven't got there on time. And they very quickly learn that actually it's not acceptable to be late, and that they will miss the start of the meeting if they're late, and so they will start to turn up on time. So hopefully that has given you some hints and tips on how to run a meeting. There are some resources on the website, our website, that kind of go along with this, for instance, like draft conflict of interest policy and so on, that might be useful. But I hope that's been of use. Thank you.